Nightmare on Elm Street. Introduction. It was an ordinary Friday evening when my parents went away for the weekend, leaving me home alone. I was 16 and thrilled to have the house to myself. I ordered pizza and decided to spend the evening watching a horror movie I had long wanted to see. The movie was called Phantom Night. It was famous for its terrifying scenes and chilling atmosphere. Chapter 1. The Setup. I settled on the couch, dimmed the lights, and turned on the TV. The house was quiet except for the dull sound of rain outside the window. The movie began with a group of friends deciding to spend the night in an old abandoned house that was rumored to be cursed. At first, everything was typical: strange noises, flickering lights, and whispers in the dark. Gradually, the atmosphere became more tense. Suddenly, I heard a door creak somewhere in the house. I attributed it to the draft and continued watching the movie. But then I heard rustling that seemed to come from the kitchen. I paused the movie and went to check. Chapter 2. The Encounter. The kitchen was dark, with only the moonlight coming through the window. I looked around and found nothing. It's probably just my imagination, I thought, returning to the movie. I sat back on the couch and pressed play. But a few minutes later, I heard noise again, this time from the hallway. My nerves were on edge, and I decided to check once more. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked down the hall, trying not to make any noise. Suddenly, the light in the hallway flickered and went out. I stopped, feeling my heart pounding. In the dim light of the flashlight, I saw a shadow flit at the end of the hall. I quickly turned around and went back to the living room, locking the door behind me. Chapter 3. The Revelation. I sat back on the couch, trying to calm down. It's just a movie, it's playing with my imagination, I kept telling myself. But when I turned the movie back on, something strange happened. The characters began to address me as if they could see me. One of them said, "You're not alone, someone is watching you." I turned off the TV and sat in complete darkness. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, I heard someone coming up the stairs. The steps were heavy and slow, as if someone was deliberately trying to be very quiet. Chapter 4. The Climax. I grabbed my phone and tried to call my parents, but there was no signal. I was trapped in my own home. The footsteps grew closer. I locked myself in my room and tried to hide under the bed. Suddenly, the door to my room slowly opened, and I saw the shadow of a person. He slowly approached the bed and stopped right in front of it. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The shadow slowly bent down, and I felt cold fingers grab my leg and pull me out from under the bed. Epilogue. I woke up the next morning on the floor of my room. The door was closed and nothing was disturbed. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, but bruises remained on my leg from those cold fingers. Since then, I never watched horror movies alone again. I learned to appreciate company and never to stay alone in the house. Sometimes at night, I still hear those footsteps and feel the cold fear from which I can never escape. The Midnight Horror. It was a stormy Saturday night, and my parents had gone out for a late dinner, leaving me home alone. The wind howled outside, and the rain pounded against the windows. I decided to pass the time by watching a horror movie that had recently been released, The Midnight Horror. The movie was said to be so terrifying that many couldn't watch it alone. But I was up for the challenge. I settled into the living room, dimming the lights to set the mood. With a bowl of popcorn in hand, I started the movie. It began with a group of friends who decided to summon spirits as a dare. The eerie soundtrack and the suspenseful buildup immediately drew me in. Thunder rumbled outside, adding to the atmosphere. As the movie progressed, strange things began happening on screen. Lights flickering, objects moving on their own, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I was thoroughly engrossed, feeling the tension build with each passing minute. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed it off as the storm. The movie characters were now in deep trouble, and the supernatural entities they had summoned were wreaking havoc. Just as one of the characters screamed, a flash of lightning illuminated my living room, and the power went out. I was plunged into darkness with only the sound of rain and thunder filling the silence. I fumbled for my phone and turned on its flashlight. The eerie glow added to the already creepy atmosphere. I decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement, hoping to restore power. As I made my way through the dark house, I heard another thud, this time followed by a creaking sound. Reaching the basement door, I hesitated. The creaking continued, and it sounded like it was coming from the basement. Gathering my courage, I slowly descended the stairs. My flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I finally reached the circuit breaker and flipped the switches. The power came back on, but as I turned to go back upstairs, I saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was a shadowy silhouette, barely discernible in the dim light. I froze in fear, unable to move. The figure slowly started descending the stairs, its footsteps echoing in the basement. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, the figure vanished. I bolted upstairs, my heart pounding. I locked the basement door behind me and rushed back to the living room. The movie was still playing, and the characters were in the midst of a terrifying climax. I picked up my phone to call my parents, but there was no signal due to the storm. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and the living room lights began to flicker. I turned to see the shadowy figure from the basement standing in the corner of the room. This time, I could see its eyes, dark and hollow, staring right at me. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my composure. The figure moved closer, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I grabbed the nearest object, a candlestick, and swung it at the figure. It passed right through, and the figure dissipated into thin air. The lights flickered back to normal, and everything seemed still. My parents returned a few hours later, and I told them everything. They chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by the horror movie and the storm. But I knew what I had seen was real. Since that night, I never watched horror movies alone, especially during a storm. The memory of those hollow eyes haunted me, a reminder of the terror that lurked in the shadows of my own home. The terror in the reflection. It was a stormy Friday night, and my parents had left for the weekend to visit some relatives. I was home alone, looking forward to a quiet evening. I decided to pass the time by watching a horror movie that I'd been eager to see, The Terror in the Reflection. The reviews said it was one of the scariest movies ever made, and I was ready to be terrified. I made a big bowl of popcorn, dimmed the lights, and settled into the couch. The wind howled outside, and rain lashed against the windows, creating the perfect, eerie ambiance. The movie started with a group of friends exploring an abandoned mansion rumored to be haunted by a vengeful spirit. As the tension in the movie built up, I felt myself getting more and more engrossed in the storyline. About halfway through the movie, there was a particularly intense scene where one of the characters, alone in a dimly lit room, was staring into an old, dusty mirror. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror changed. The character's reflection had a sinister grin and bloodshot eyes. The character in the movie didn't notice at first, but as soon as he did, the lights in his room went out. At that exact moment, a loud clap of thunder shook my house, and the power went out. I was plunged into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight and tried to calm myself down. It was just a power outage, nothing more. With the flashlight on, I decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement. I made my way down the creaky wooden stairs, each step echoing in the silent house. The basement was cold and damp, and I could hear the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the darkness. As I approached the circuit breaker, I felt an unsettling chill run down my spine. I managed to reset the breaker, and the lights flickered back on. Relieved, I headed back upstairs. As I passed by the hallway mirror, I glanced at my reflection and froze. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I shook my head, blaming my imagination and the creepy movie. Back in the living room, I resumed the movie. The character in the film was now being tormented by the spirit from the mirror. Every time he looked into a reflective surface, he saw the spirit getting closer and closer. The fear in his eyes mirrored my own unease. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, almost like a breath, right next to my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. Determined not to let my fear get the better of me, I continued watching. The climax of the movie was terrifying. The spirit finally emerged from the mirror, dragging the character into the dark abyss. Just as the spirit reached out from the screen, the lights in my house flickered again. I screamed as I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I jumped up, my heart racing, and saw my own reflection in the TV screen. My reflection was distorted, with a twisted grin and glowing eyes, just like in the movie. I backed away, tripping over the coffee table, and fell to the floor. The room was filled with a menacing laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In a blind panic, I grabbed my phone and called my parents. The call went through, but all I could hear was static and that same eerie laugh. I dropped the phone and ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. Suddenly, all the mirrors in the house began to rattle violently. The reflections twisted and writhed, showing monstrous faces instead of my own. I could feel the presence of something evil closing in on me. With no other option, I ran upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door. I hid under the bed, clutching a baseball bat for protection. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, listening to the sounds of footsteps and whispers outside my door. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows and the house was silent. Cautiously, I emerged from my hiding spot and found everything back to normal. My parents returned later that day, and I told them everything. They didn't believe me, of course, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and the effects of the horror movie. But I knew what I had experienced was real. I could still feel the cold touch on my shoulder and hear that sinister laugh. Since that night, I've never watched a horror movie alone, and I've covered all the mirrors in my house. But every now and then I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A twisted grin, a pair of glowing eyes, reminding me that the terror in the reflection is always watching.